So let's talk about aging. It happens to all of us, and as we get older, the ways that we deal with all sorts of activities change. Language is definitely no exception. The way that we pick up new languages as adults is really different from how we pick up our native tongues as little babies. But what about learning a new language once you've already got one, but while you're still little? It may be easier to pick up something new as a kid, but it's still no walk in the park. I'm Moti Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
So we've talked a number of times before about how amazing babies are at picking up their first languages. They're total pros. Even if you throw two different languages at them at the same time, they have no trouble sorting all of that data into two different bins to build two different systems. Other than a few biological processes of varying degrees of grossness, there's nothing babies do better than language. You might expect that this would mean that little kids moving somewhere new would be much better at picking up a new language than grown-ups. And this is true, but as we'll see, even being a baby is no guarantee of complete success when you're picking up a new language. So you might remember our episode about L2 transfer, where we talked about how what you have from your first language really carries over when you're learning your second. But that was about adults. What happens if you pick up an L2 as a kid? Does it work the same way, or do child and adult L2 learners just take different paths through the black-shrouded forest of transfer? There's been a lot of studies on this, but let's look at an example from Dutch. In Dutch, word order is a lot freer than it is in English. So for example, if you want to say that Hildebrand threw the ball twice, you can say this. Hildebrand heeft 2 keer de bal gegooid. Or you can say Hildebrand heeft de bal 2 keer gegooid. Both are fine. This is called scrambling, but it doesn't mean that you can just move words around wherever you like, willy-nilly. Sometimes scrambling really changes the meaning of a sentence. And for Dutch, the best way to see this is by putting in negation. If you want to say that Hildebrand didn't throw the ball, then you need to scramble, like in Hildebrand heeft de bal niet gegooid. Leaving it in place, as in Hildebrand heeft niet de bal gegooid, is only okay if you're trying to imply that Hildebrand threw something else, like a frisbee or a spear. Okay, so now the question becomes, if you're learning Dutch, how much of a grasp do you have on when it's okay to scramble your sentences interchangeably and when it's not? Well, a study looked at exactly this, comparing native speakers who had been learning the language from birth with two different groups of English speakers picking up Dutch as an L2, adults and kids. The researchers acted out a story with puppets, and then asked participants to agree or disagree with an explanation of what happened, and then explain it themselves. We want to be sure that if people are making mistakes, it's not because they're trying to do something different with their language. This kind of task makes all participants create sentences from the same situations, to try to get the same structures for them without biasing them. So what happened? Well, of course, the native speakers were doing the scrambling that they were supposed to. And our L2 speakers? Well, a lot of the adults and some of the kids were scrambling just like the native speakers and denying that Hildebrand was throwing anything. But others didn't scramble properly and made sentences where the word order was just wrong for Dutch. So like putting the noun at the end of the sentence after the verb. You wouldn't do that in Dutch, but you would do that in English, and so it's pretty clear that kids, along with adults, have transferred over their English grammar and just haven't Dutched it up yet. But maybe these kids were making the same kinds of mistakes as the adults because they got into learning the language too late. Is there a best before date for your brain when it comes to L2s? Comparing how old people were when they moved to their new country to how good they can get at their new language can help answer that question. A study looked at 240 native speakers of Korean who moved to the United States at anywhere between 1 to 23 years old. And at least for the syntax, when it came to judging questions of whether sentences of English were right or wrong, people who started learning English as adults made some mistakes in deciding whether you could swap go for goes in a sentence like, every Friday I go exploring with my friends. Or that you can ask, where did she put the hammer, and not, why did she put the hammer? But if you started learning English when you were a baby or a preschooler, no problem. The study didn't really find any differences in the syntax between native speakers who were born in the US and kids who immigrated at up to 7 years old. There's a lot of research that shows that the earlier you get exposed to your L2, the more stuff you'll be able to recover. And if you want to know more about that, we'll have some more on the extra materials on our website. Now, it's possible that there's just something special about syntax. The rules that structure language are complex. You really need to have acquired the syntax in your L1 before you can transfer it to your L2. And syntax takes a long time to learn, but there are things that you acquire way earlier, like your sounds. Do really little kids show L1 transfer in their phonology since they acquire it sooner? It turns out that it's relatively easy to test how even tiny babies deal with language sounds. So some of the most interesting research about early L2 acquisition has to do with phonology. For example, one experiment studied 6-month-old Swedish and American babies and looked at how they categorize sounds. The sound E is a phoneme in English, which means that it creates a contrasted meaning. So like, B is a different thing than boo. But English doesn't care about U, unlike Swedish, which cares about both E and U. You can tell because in Swedish, beat and boot mean two different things, peace and change. So experimenters played both sets of babies, recorded syllables with either E or U. And sometimes the syllables had a prototypical vowel sound, like a really ideal fi or fu, but sometimes they were a little off the mark, like fu. Then, the researchers checked what sounds the babies were interested in using the head-turn preference procedure. So they turned their heads in the direction of something cool, and then they would look away when that something cool got boring. And it turned out that babies were way more interested in the prototypical sounds of their language than anything else. Swedish babies cared a lot about both fi and fu, but not about the in-betweeny stuff. The English babies only liked fi, and you couldn't get them interested even in the most beautiful prototypical fu sound. That's for tiny Swedes, that's not for me. Ignore. This is actually pretty useful, right? It means that by the time that they're 6 months old, kids are already starting to craft the phonetic categories that are relevant for their language. 6 months, that's really early. And when they hear something that's less than ideal, it doesn't matter. They just assume it's part of the random variation that's coming at them all of the time, and then go about their bodily functions unfazed. We see something similar in the Korean study that we mentioned earlier. The researchers found really significant links between how old you are when you immigrate and how native-like your English sounds. Your phonology has a super strong influence on your accent, and people who moved to the US even as little babies still had more of a non-native accent than those born there. So just like the Swedish study, the sounds of Korean had already been learned by the time the kids were 1. So it looks like you can only transfer over what you've already got. The inventory of your sounds gets figured out really soon after birth, and so it's much easier to get stuck with that than the structure of your syntax, which you pick up over your first few years. Kids picking up a second language still have a lot of learning to do, and their brains have to grow into their language through experience and neural development, as we'll talk about more in the future. But even if kids do have an easier time than adults with new languages, they still have to struggle with some of the same problems. Transfer happens from really early on. But the more aging you've done, the harder it is to hone in on your target. So we've reached the end of the Ling space for this week. If you establish prototypical vowels, you learned that transfer for children happens as soon as they've had a chance to establish a grammar. That kids learning a new language before 7 or 8 get a lot of the syntax right, and that phonology transfers earliest because it's mastered earliest. The Ling space is produced by me, Moti Lieberman. It's directed by Delise Prévost, and it's written by both of us. Our editor is Georges Coulombe, our production assistant is Stéphane Herdevies, our music and sound design is by Shane Turner, and our graphics team is Atelier Muse. We're down in the comments below, or you can bring the discussion back over to our website where we'll have some extra material on this topic. Check us out on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook, and if you want to keep expanding your own personal Ling space, please subscribe. And we'll see you next Wednesday. Hodafez!